Good morning and welcome to the Point. We're live on Mackinac Island, where the 31st Republican Leadership Conference is wrapping up today. We're happy to have with us as one of our guests this morning, the chairman of the Michigan Republican Party, Ronna Romney McDaniel. Chairman, thank you for doing this. I know that sun's blinding you right now because it's so bright and beautiful out here, but thanks for being here.
Wonderful to be here. Glad to be on the island on a pure Michigan day in Mackinac.
Yeah, this has really been an exceptional conference because there are more presidential candidates than I recall ever coming in here. You had a good selection. Give me your takeaway. What is this conference really about? What's the value for you as a party?
Well, the conference was entitled Michigan Foundation for the Future, and we really wanted to highlight the leadership in Michigan, what we have done to bring our state back from the brink of disaster, which is where we were in the Granholm years. Now, under Governor Snyder and Republican leadership, 14% unemployment has gone to 5%, 400,000 new private sector jobs. And what that means for the average Michigander is life is better. Families are doing good in Michigan. Businesses are coming back. And we wanted to highlight that, and then we brought candidates in as keynote speakers to talk about their leadership in their respective areas and how they can apply that to their bid for the White House.
Carly Fiorina was here. She spoke at the dinner last night, as did Senator Rand Paul. Before that, there was Jeb Bush, who was in on Friday. You also had, and I'm going to forget somebody, Ted Cruz was here, and Governor John Kasich. Scott Walker has some airplane problems, some transportation problems, didn't make it. But we talked with Senator Cruz when he was here. Let's listen to that interview, and we'll come back and talk more about this conference. But first, my conversation with Senator Ted Cruz. Senator, you're off of another big debate. You obviously had an opportunity to talk to the American people and your fellow candidates. Tell me how you feel about this process, this big process of all of those candidates right now.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm incredibly encouraged. The support we're seeing, the momentum has been phenomenal. You know, in the 48 hours since the last debate, we've raised over $1 million. People all over the country going online to tedcruz.org, contributing, volunteering. The grassroots energy and enthusiasm we have here on the ground in Michigan and all over the country is just incredible. And I think the reason is simple. People recognize our country's in crisis, and they're tired of campaign conservatives, people who talk a good game on the campaign trail but haven't walked the walk. I think they're looking for a consistent conservative, someone who's been the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. I think that's why we're seeing so much grassroots support.
When you come to Michigan and you know that you have a lot of, as you said, the grassroots support, but we see a lot of good ground games in Michigan. Is Michigan more of a player this year, given the fact that you've got Midwestern governors that may take some of the air out of Ohio and Wisconsin? Does Michigan have more of a chance to make a contribution to the selection process?
I think the Michigan primary is going to be very important. It's early, and it's going to have an impact. There's a reason why we have a grassroots leadership team in this state that I think is second to none. What we've seen here in Michigan, and we're seeing this all across the country, is the old Reagan coalition coming together. We're seeing conservatives and evangelicals and libertarians. We're seeing young people and Hispanics and women and African Americans and Reagan Democrats all coming together. You know, Michigan is ground zero for the Reagan Democrats. The Reagan Revolution began here in Michigan, and the base of our campaign are Reagan Democrats. It's the working men and women who have been so hammered by the Obama economy. You know, last 6.5 years we've been trapped in stagnation. Today we have the lowest percentage of Americans working than any year since 1978. Wages are stagnating. And I'll tell you what the Democratic Party has done that is really quite extraordinary. They have chosen between two traditional favored children of the Democratic Party. And Democratic politicians, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, have chosen to go with the campaign donations of California environmentalist billionaires instead of the jobs of union members. And in my view, this election will be won by campaigning on behalf of hard-working men and women who want to believe again in the promise of America and campaigning against the bipartisan corruption of Washington that I think Hillary Clinton embodies.
The bipartisan corruption. Talk about that for just a minute, because there is a system in Washington that involves Democrats and Republicans that you don't like very much.
That is exactly right. You know, a couple of months ago, I came out with a new book entitled A Time for Truth. And in my book, I talk a great deal about what I call the Washington Cartel. The Washington Cartel consists of career politicians in both parties who get in bed with lobbyists and special interests, and they grow and grow and grow government. And people are fed up with Washington. You look at the Republican primary right now. The central theme in those debates is who will stand up to Washington. Well, I'll tell you, Rick, I'm thrilled for that to be the central question in the Republican primary, because the natural next question is, okay, who actually has stood up to Washington? Who has a record of taking on not just Democrats, but leadership in their own party? And I am the only one on that stage that has a proven record over and over again of taking on the Washington cartel, the career politicians in both parties, and standing and fighting for the Constitution, for freedom, and for we the people. If we're going to turn this country around, we got to take power out of Washington and bring it back to we the people. That's why our campaign is a grassroots campaign. That's where the energy and passion and his excitement is. That's how Reagan won in 1980, and I am convinced 2016 is going to be an election very much like 1980, and we're going to win by following Reagan's admonition of painting not in pale pastels, but in bold colors.
Senator Ted Cruz talking with us yesterday on his visit here to the Republican Leadership Conference on Mackinac Island. We also had the chance to talk with Ohio Governor John Kasich as we talked about the rollout and fast rise of his campaign. Governor, when we last talked, you were at the end of a long stretch of rolling out your campaign, and people were just getting to know that you were running for president. And my question in my mind was, I wonder how this is going to go. A few weeks later, and 2 top-tier debate appearances, you have started to gain some recognition from people who might not have looked at you before. How do you feel about the way this campaign has rolled out?
Well, you know, we feel pretty good. I mean, the most important thing right now is I'm running second in New Hampshire, you know, from 14th to 2 in a short period of time. And we're raising money, and we're getting volunteers, and people are signing up, so I feel pretty good about it. But it's a long road. You know, you have the debates, but debates are only one part of an overall puzzle that you have to put together. And I think we're really doing well. We're rising, and just got to keep going and not make any. I'll probably make a major mistake sooner or later, and. But at this point, I feel pretty good about things.
You spoke in Grand Rapids at your rollout about raising everybody up.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that again in the debate the other night. Is yours a message of more hope than perhaps some of the other candidates? In other words, talking about working to bring up all people?
Well, you know, here's the thing. I'm a solutions guy, okay? So you be governor of Ohio like Governor Snyder of Michigan. You can have a lot of theories, but you got to know what works. And I believe that economic growth, number one, is the most important thing, and reshaping the government and making sure it's more efficient and more effective. But once you start getting that economic growth, it's important that everybody feels as though they have a stake in it, because I think there are growing numbers of Americans who think that they don't matter and they don't count. And I don't think that lends itself to a healthy America. So it's a message that I've had in Ohio, and it's a message I have out here. And I tell you what, I think it's a message that people will like in Michigan. You know, Michigan and Ohio, they're the same. We just have a border, right, that separates us. They're hardworking. They're smart people. They're God-fearing. They're common sense, and they want to rise. Everybody wants to rise. Look at Detroit. I mean, Detroit is becoming more and more hopeful. But hope is a big part of life, and it's not just the rhetoric, it's also making sure that they feel as though they're being listened to.
When you have people who feel, I'll use the word disenfranchised, but I think that's what you're talking about, people that don't have hope.
I'm not even talking about, I mean, there are people who you wouldn't think, who think the system's bad, it doesn't work, you know, a 51-year-old guy that loses his job and he doesn't know where he's going to turn. I mean, there's a lot of that anxiety out there.
How do you, not just through the campaign, but how do you, as a practical matter, obviously better economics helps more people, but how do you get people re-engaged, re-involved? Because there are some people that really do feel like they're just outside the bounds of
Well, we've got a couple specific programs in Ohio, like fighting drugs, making sure that people are involved in their community in fighting drugs. Mentoring programs that we're now promoting, programs that reward volunteerism. These are the kind of things that say to people, look, we're not great because of who our president is. I mean, presidents matter, but we're great when we, from the bottom up, heal our own communities and take care of our families. And it doesn't mean that we're not a partnership with government up above or with anybody up above, but we're great from the bottom up. I mean, that's the town where I grew up, where we were a community, and I think that's important, that every life really does matter.
Will this next 3 months hinge more on people's attitudes towards the international events that we heard so much about in the debate the other night, or is this going to be about domestic policies, things?
Oh, I think it always gets back to jobs. I mean, unless we have a war outbreak or an attack, God forbid, it always gets down to the economy. Do I feel better about where I am? Do I think my kids who graduated from college with debt can get a job? Can I start a business without the government smothering me with some stupid rule? I mean, I think that's what always is the most important issue. Not that the other ones don't matter, but that, I think, is always front and center.
We're live on Mackinac Island for this morning's To the Point because the Republican Leadership Conference, 31st, is wrapping up. Chairman, this is an interesting situation because you had a lot of presidential candidates here. What does that tell you about the state and the fact that it may be in place? Certainly as the primary goes, the general will have to wait and see.
Well, Michigan Matters in 2016. We've had 10 candidates in Michigan just in the past 6 months, and now we've had them here on Mackinac for this conference. We had record attendance, the highest attendance we have ever had for this type of conference. People in Michigan are energized. They're coming to look at the candidates. The candidates are investing the time in our state to get to know our issues, to get to know the voters, to understand our story and our comeback and how they can convey to voters that they'll do the same thing when they're in Washington, because it's a turnaround story in our state like we want to see in our nation.
Well, speaking of that turnaround, I took that same question to Governor Snyder. I talked to him yesterday on the other end of the porch. Here's what he had to say about it. Governor, these conferences are always about politics and policy and networking and all the things that go on, but this one has particularly been focused on presidential politics, big field, big gear, and a lot of folks. There were 6 scheduled. Transportation, kind of stormy weather, I think, that we had earlier kept Governor Walker from getting here, but 5 contenders have been here on the island. What does that say to you about Michigan's place in this race?
Well, I think Michigan's going to play a very important role, and I think that was confirmed with the candidates that came in. If you think about it, I think both in the primary and the general election, people view Michigan as very important, and I think it's going to pay off for the candidates that made the effort to get here. There were over 2,000 leaders in the grassroots of the Republican Party here. It's a great way to build relationships, get your message across first person. So it's been a success.
So today the conference will be wrapping up. Chairman, talk to me a little bit about what this means. What's the takeaway? Because now all the campaigns move back over the mainland, and you've got to turn this for the candidates now, and you hope for the party later, into some kind of victory.
There were several takeaways from the conference for me. One, Michigan's on the comeback. We're continuing that. We're building a great future for the citizens of Michigan. 2, we have a great field of candidates. We had 5 of them on the island, and the enthusiasm was everywhere. They all performed well. Their speeches were well received. And 3, Michigan is in play in 2016, and Republicans are taking our state seriously. And we haven't seen a Democrat here for a long, long time.
Well, I thank you very much for doing the show with us this morning. I know there's a lot going on. Thanks for having us up here, and we'll stay in touch. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.
There's a lot more going on around the state. In fact, one of the things that came out from the debate on Wednesday night was a real concern about some international policies. And when we come back, we'll hear from Democratic Senator Gary Peters and his take on that. Next, To the Point. Welcome back to the Point, live from Mackinac Island. You know, there's a lot going on here on the island, a lot of politics, obviously, but there's also a lot going on internationally, and we heard a lot about that on the debate on Wednesday night. Earlier this week, I sat down with Michigan's junior senator, Democrat Gary Peters, to talk to him after he had just returned from the troubled Middle East. Senator, I want to start with a troubling story out of the Middle East. You just got back, where you were visiting a Syrian refugee camp. 85,000 people in that camp, you think?
Yeah.
This is a massive problem on a scale that most of us don't understand. Tell me what you saw, and then tell me what you thought as you saw this.
Well, there's no question this is a humanitarian crisis of immense scale. So I was in Zatari, which is the largest refugee camp in Jordan. As you mentioned, about 85,000 people. There is another camp, 20,000 or so. A lot of refugees aren't in camps, are kind of spread out around the country as well. But to be in the camp, to walk in there, this is a camp in the middle of the desert, basically. Folks are in manufactured housing, not tents. They've been moved out of that. It's more permanent. But you're in manufactured housing in a very hot climate. The food rations are fairly limited. My understanding is that it's roughly 50 cents a day is what folks get in the camp. There are places where they can purchase some foodstuffs around the camp. They get one propane bottle a month to cook from. And have no hope. I mean, I talked to a number of folks who were there. Some of them had been there over a couple of years and don't see any future. They're there trying to get their kids to school. UNICEF does a nice job of providing educational opportunities for the children, but there really is no hope for folks. In fact, when we were there at the camp, they said they're now starting to see an outflow of folks who are going back to Syria. But to a very uncertain place, and they know they could die. There are barrel bombs and a very dangerous environment, but they just feel this despair of being in camp with no hope, and they said, I'd rather go back and try to do something rather than be here, and which is why you're also having folks go to Europe and are taking great risks to go to Europe. We have to deal with the situation, and there's been a lot of talk about taking refugees into our country, and the Europeans have been doing that, and I think those are important things that we need to talk about. But I think it's also important to know that in talking to the refugees in the camp, they don't want to go to the United States, they don't want to go to Europe, they want to go home. They want to go back to their home in Syria.
Well, that raises about 20 different questions, so I'll try to cut it down to a couple. First of all, as we see this problem magnified, as you talked about in Europe and elsewhere where refugees are flowing through in big numbers, what does the international community have to do to deal with people who are legitimately scared, afraid, displaced, that need food and shelter and all of that? And some people that may be involved in those groups, may be infiltrated in those groups that are carrying an ideology into these areas, not just because they're refugees.
Well, it's true. So anytime you have any kind of those programs, you have to make sure you're vetting people and screening folks to do it. But, the first part of your question is the international community is stepping up to make sure that basic food resources, basic humanitarian resources are provided to these individuals, I think is absolutely essential. What we learned at Za'atari is that a lot of the funding that has been promised is all starting to come to an end in the next month or two. That 50 cents a day ration may not be there. I will say people were very appreciative of the United States of America and the generosity of the American people. It's basically the United States that has funded most of the humanitarian relief. It's unfortunate that the Gulf states in that area have not been stepping up, providing resources. The Europeans haven't been providing resources in Jordan and other places. It's been the American people, and the world community needs to step up to make sure that basic humanitarian relief is provided to these families who are struggling.
It's particularly disappointing to hear you say that the Gulf states haven't stepped up, because they are not without resource.
In fact, part of our trip, we were in places that have a lot of resources, so they definitely have the ability, the means to do it, and have not stepped up to their responsibilities in their region. This is in their backyard.
So the last question on this subject is the last thing you said. These folks don't want to go to Europe. They don't want to go to the United States. They want to go home. But home isn't there anymore. I mean, physically it is, but the environment, as you point out, is extraordinarily dangerous, extraordinarily unstable. We've been in the region for over a decade. You and your military service have seen it firsthand. What do we do? Is there anything that we can do to help affect these people being able to be repatriated to a place where they can actually have hope for a real, sustainable life and society?
Well, yeah, that's what we have to do, and we have to be focused. That was really a big part of my trip, was meeting with both our military commanders in the field, dealing with ISIS. We have, of course, in Syria, you've got two problems there. You've got ISIS and their extremism, and then you have the Assad regime as well, which has a very horrible record when it comes to taking care of their own people. But the main focus of the United States right now has been ISIS, as well as the world community, which I'm happy to say the reports that I got was that the air campaign has been very successful in at least slowing down ISIS advance and making it more difficult for them to move. But in order to win that, you have to have folks on the ground, and it's not going to be U.S. troops. It's going to have to be in Iraq. It'll have to be the Iraqi forces who, as we all know, They ran when they had an opportunity to step up. They didn't. In talking to the commanders in Baghdad when I was in Iraq, they believe that they have a credible fighting force that is willing to fight, that they're slowly building, that will be able to take back some of that ground. Syria, however, is more problematic. There's efforts to train Syrian free fighters, but the information that I got was not very encouraging that we've been very successful in that range. So this is not going to be something that's going to be easy. It's not something that's going to be quick, but it's something that ultimately, in addition to the military action, you've got to have a political solution. And unfortunately, the recent news of the Russians moving into Syria is only going to complicate things even more.
Well, it's a very complicated region. I don't want to take the entire time that we have together to talk about it, but I do want to talk to you about another pivotal issue, which is the Iran deal that Secretary Kerry and the President have been pushing very hard. As we sit here today, it appears that this is pretty much a done deal in terms of the President is going to be able to, if there is some opposition, the President can probably veto that, and you can't override that veto in the Senate. So this policy, at least from this observer standpoint, appears to be something going forward, but it hasn't been without controversy.
No, it hasn't, and it is a very complex agreement, and I have supported the agreement in the short run, although I have serious reservations about the long term in the agreement, and it means we're going to have to stay focused. I think there are some short-term benefits to this, and quite frankly, I don't know if we had much of an option. In fact, part of our briefings, and I've had extensive briefings, classified, unclassified, meeting with key negotiators, but we also met with representatives of the P5+1, including Russia and China, the ambassadors from the European countries, who said this is the deal. We're not going back to the negotiating table, so we didn't have really much of a choice. But having said that, I think in the short run, you will see that Iran will have to give up their uranium, their stock of uranium. They're not going to be able to enrich to the levels that they were enriching before, which would be a pathway to a bomb. They can't use the reactor for plutonium. That's going to be repurposed. There's a very robust inspection regime. So in the short run, I believe that we will accomplish the end, which is to make it so that the Iranians don't have a pathway to a bomb. Or if they do, we extend the breakout period from 3 months to probably over a year. Now, having said that, I have strong reservations about supporting this in the long term, because unfortunately they are put on a path that starting in year 10 and then in year 15, they can enrich uranium in an industrial style way. And that's just simply unacceptable. So we have a few years to deal with that, but we have to do it, and I think we have to do it from the world community perspective, because it's not just Iran that I'm concerned about enriching uranium, but it's other countries as well. And it has been in the past U.S. policy that there's no enrichment. You can have a peaceful nuclear program, but you can't enrich on your own soil. In fact, 20 countries now have peaceful nuclear programs, but they don't enrich on their soil. I hope folks don't look at this agreement with Iran and say, well, maybe there is a right to enrich, because here you have a country who's is known as a financing terrorism across the region and other places. So they're allowed to enrich. If they can enrich, why can't we? So I think it's incumbent on us over these next few years, and something I plan to work very diligently on, is to make sure we have an international regime that says we will not tolerate enrichment, certainly above levels of 4 or 5%, which is okay for peaceful power. Doesn't get you to the weapon, but once you go beyond that level, then those are purposes that the world community cannot tolerate. So I think in the quick answer, in the short run, I think we're going to be okay, but that doesn't mean we can take our eye off the ball. We've got to hold everybody accountable, keep everybody's feet to the fire, especially the Iranians, who I do not trust.
Our thanks to Senator Gary Peters for talking with us about those international issues. We also had a good conversation about some domestic issues, and I want you to join us here next Sunday morning as you'll hear part of that conversation as well. More about next week's show and the conference here on Mackinac Island when we come back with more To the Point. Our thanks to Senator Gary Peters, to Senator Cruz, also to Governor Kasich and Governor Snyder, and a special thanks to Ronna Romney McDaniel for being live with us here this morning from Mackinac Island. The Republican Leadership Conference is now history, but going from this island, we'll continue to follow this very pivotal presidential race. And next week, more of our conversation with Senator Peters, with Governor Snyder, and with former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. That all comes up next Sunday morning at 10 o'clock on Wood TV 8 for To the Point.